Hello, this is Malachi Bishop. This is RC-750 Rehabilitation Counseling Research and Program Evaluation, and we're continuing our discussion of program evaluation. In this section, we're talking about analyzing results and reporting our results. And I just have a couple of things to say about analyzing the results, and then we'll spend most of our time talking about the presentation and reporting of the evaluation results, and then consider some ethical issues involved. So with respect to analyzing qualitative and quantitative data, with respect to qualitative data, some things to keep in mind and think about. If you have a qualitative program evaluation, or if your program evaluation includes qualitative data, typically the way that this data is analyzed, and this is a sort of a broad stroke. We've talked and you've read about the more specific details of analyzing and reporting qualitative data, but basically it's a process of reading through all the data that was collected and organizing the comments into similar categories. For example, shared concerns or suggestions, strengths and weaknesses that were noted about the program. And then once you have organized your comments into similar categories, labeling the categories or themes, and then presenting them in those categories. For example, in attempting to identify patterns or associations between the themes, you might have a category. For example, you might report that all people who attended programs in the evening had similar concerns. So you might observe that pattern in the data. Or most people who reported satisfaction came from the same urban geographic area, while most who were dissatisfied were from rural communities. So patterns, categories like that. Remember to keep all your qualitative data for several years, or in some cases your agency will have guidelines or rules about how long data should be kept, but in general, make sure you keep it for at least several years after you have completed your program evaluation, in case it is needed for future reference or referral. Obviously, that data should be de-identified and kept in a safe place, and de-identified meaning the comments that were made should be separated from any identifying information about the people who made it. In terms of quantitative data, some things to keep in mind. We won't talk about the many various ways that quantitative data could be analyzed, except some general guidelines. First is make sure you make copies of your data and store the master copy away. And I've learned this the hard way. Don't do all your work with your only copy of the data. Make a copy, put the master copy away somewhere safe in case your computer freezes up and you lose it. That's a hard lesson to learn. Use the copy for making your, doing your analyses, making your edits, and cutting and pasting and so on. But put the original data away somewhere safe. Second one is to consider the recipients. And when you're presenting the results of your qualitative or quantitative data analysis, think about who you are presenting the results to. Some audiences may be well versed in statistical analyses, and so they may be more comfortable with more research article sort of language. Other audience will be more general audience, and so they'll be less familiar and less able to use more formal statistical language, and so you would need to present the information in a way that it would make sense to that audience. So think about the people who are using the report and present your analyses and results in a way that will make sense to them. Consider multiple approaches to presenting data, including words, tables, and graphs. So sometimes presenting the numeric data visually, for example, is a very effective way to make your point, and more convincing or more helpful than simply using a verbal or written description, or even a numeric description. So think about different approaches to presenting your data, but don't be too tricky. Remember, good graphics don't make up for poor research, and it's important, even though you can do a lot of pretty cool looking graphics these days with the software that are available, the important thing is that your audience understands what the data means. And then finally, ask what is the most meaningful way to present this to the particular audience that's going to be using this information. So in terms of presenting the results, reporting the results, as with planning the evaluation, the important thing is to ask some important questions before you even start. So before you begin, ask yourself, how can I make sure that the results are as accurate, valid, and reliable as possible? How can I make sure that the results will be useful to the audience? And how can I present the results so that they can be understood and used by the audience, by the people who will be using the program evaluation? Think about who is the report for. Again, think about your audience, and in reporting the information, think about, am I reporting this in a way that makes sense to them? Sometimes we get caught up in the program evaluation, and we know it backward and forward, and we know exactly what we mean. But you have to think about the people who will be using the information, and make sure that you present it in a way that will be meaningful for them. All right, in terms of actually writing the report, we're going to go through a few steps here. Step 1, think about giving the report context. And by that I mean, you want your report to stand alone, to be meaningful by itself over time. And that means if somebody picked up your report in 5 or 10 years, I think they should be able to read it and understood exactly what was happening, exactly why you did what you did, exactly what you did, and so on. So you need to give your report context, give the information that a reader anywhere at any time would be able to pick it up and understand what the program was about and what your program evaluation was about. So provide some context about the evaluation, why you were doing it, and what you did. You want it to be understood by multiple stakeholders. You don't want to tell the recipients what they already know. So find the right balance of information. You don't necessarily need to go through the whole history of the program, although sometimes that might be appropriate, but you don't want to spend a lot of time telling the recipients things that they already know. Sometimes it's more appropriate to just get right to the meat of the question. So, but also in order to keep to provide the recipients with the information that they need in the way that they need it. It's a tricky balance. In terms of writing the report and the format, I think it's important to start with the purpose, talk about the questions that you asked, and present the research questions that you were seeking to address, and then talk about your procedures or methods and why you chose to do the things you did the way you did it. So it's a lot like a research article in terms of just looking at the format. What was the purpose? What was the question? And then what were the methods? And then you present the findings. And the way you will do this in a program evaluation report is, first of all, basically to describe what you found. So present your results, and you may do this in terms of each question that you asked. You would then present the findings related to that question. So you would describe the findings, and then you might analyze the findings. So what do the findings mean in the context of the larger program? And you want to present the information in a manner that is meaningful, sensible to the audience, and that is guided by the questions that you asked. Arrange the data and information for ease of interpretation. In other words, I like to think of it as telling the story. Present the information in a way that makes sense to the reader. Start with the most important research questions, the most important information. Make sure that you're presenting the story clearly. Remember that for you, who have been involved in the evaluation, it can be easy to get lost in the details. Again, put yourself in the reader's perspective, and I think it's a good idea to put the report away after you've written it for a few days. Put it away and then take it out and read it again and see if after having put it away for a few days, you pick it up, you have a fresh perspective, and you see if it makes sense to you as a reader. Provide all the information that is necessary. So make sure that you address all the questions and provide all the information that is needed for the reader to understand what the question was and what the answer was, that the results were, in a clear manner that they will understand. Be clear about what you measured, how you measured it, what was analyzed, and how you analyzed it. So talk about the relationships that you looked at, the differences that you found. Leave no room for misinterpretation, and particularly on critically important points. So make it obvious, make it clear what you did, how you did it, and what you found. And then the fifth step is perhaps the most important, your interpretation of the findings. It's your responsibility as the researcher or evaluator to give context and meaning to the information. Without interpretation, everything else you have done may be meaningless if it didn't make sense to the people who are reading the report. Then really the report doesn't have any value. So it's important to make sure that you spend some time getting to understand the results and what they mean to the people for whom you're doing the evaluation. Interpret what it means, and when you're interpreting the results, make sure that you don't overreach, meaning interpret and describe what you have found based on the evidence, but don't interpret and don't present information that is not based on what you found, not based on the evidence. And then identify the limitations in the evaluation and in your approach. What are the things that you either didn't do that maybe should have done, or what were some of the limitations in the process of the evaluation that limit your ability to provide all the information maybe that's necessary. And then finally, the recommendation section. Establish the focus of the recommendations with the stakeholders as part of the design. So this means, remember back at the beginning when you engaged the stakeholders and you thought about, at the end of this, what do I want to be able to say? All right, that's what I mean by establish the focus of the recommendations with the stakeholders. Talk at the beginning of the process about which aspects of the program you want to be able to address in your recommendations. Now, in presenting your recommendations, again, emphasize basing and limiting your recommendations to the evaluation and the findings. Sometimes you find things that may be interesting to you, but not necessarily relevant to the program evaluation. So limit your findings to the questions of the evaluation. In presenting your recommendations, as in an evaluation report or any other sort of report, you want to prioritize them. So you want to think about what are the most important recommendations and make those come first. Make specific recommendations that can be followed. Okay, that's very important. So if you're making a recommendation, make it specific, make it meaningful, and make it something that they can actually do. And you'll be able to do this if you know the program and you have taken the time to learn and understand the program and how it works. Discuss the costs and benefits and the reasons for the recommendations that you're making. Think about your recommendations, and I say that because it is really important to spend some time actually thinking about what you're telling the program to do or recommending to the program. Seems almost unnecessary to say that, but I think the more time you spend thinking about your recommendations, how you're going to phrase them, and what you're going to say, the better. So and then again, recommend putting the report away, taking them out a couple of days later, reading them, and thinking about them again. In terms of the actual format of a program evaluation report, the style may be professional, maybe academic, maybe executive, consumer friendly, public friendly. The point is, you as the report writer need to think about what is the most appropriate and effective approach for you to express your findings. Generally, program evaluation reports should be professional, but you need to think again about the audience and the style that's going to be most effective and most appropriate for the people who are going to be reading your report. You need to think about the level of information and the level of detail in the report. Do you need to provide history? How much history? How much data? How much of the results and which results? And how much detail in your interpretation? And really, this is a matter of, again, communicating with the program and the audience and getting a sense of what they are looking for. Make sure that you credit any participants who assisted you and any contributors who were involved, and then make sure you discuss the stakeholders' needs before you begin. So I think it's useful to ask for examples. As you are meeting with the stakeholders, as you're getting ready to conduct your program evaluation, ask the stakeholders what sort of information would be particularly useful for them. In terms of the ethical considerations in program evaluation and report writing, the first one from our professional code of ethics for rehabilitation counselors. I'm just going back to revisit something we talked about earlier in the semester. Section I, number 1, research responsibilities. Remember, as principal researcher and as program evaluator, the ultimate responsibility for ethical research practice lies with the principal researchers, the principal program evaluator. So the responsibility lies with you as the principal researcher, program evaluator. All others involved in the research activities share ethical obligations and responsibilities for their own actions. Next ethical consideration, and this is true in our whether you're a researcher doing your own personal research or a person doing public program evaluation. One always wants to find support for one's own theories or ideas, or to provide the answers that the people want to hear if you're doing a program evaluation. We and the people we're working for like to be right. And so there's always the temptation to avoid disappointing our audience or avoid being wrong or avoid being irrelevant. This creates the possibility for the consideration of unethical behavior, including things like discarding unfavorable data or modifying the data so it will fit the answers that our program audience, the people who are asking for our program evaluation, want to hear. Asking loaded or leading questions. Overgeneralizing. Using biased samples, using samples that are likely to give the answers that you want to get. Data dredging, which means going through the data and finding the data that you want, that you can use to support your position. Data manipulation and misrepresentation, and selective reporting. The best approach in dealing with the temptation to provide the answers that other people want from you or to support your own position is obviously to be honest and ethical, since that is sometimes difficult, and that's the whole point of this conversation. There are things that you can do to help support yourself to take honest and ethical action. So first thing you can do is make sure that you have established clear expectations and realistic and limited promises with your program evaluation partners. Don't make promises about what you'll find, and have clear and realistic expectations up front. Collaborate. Work with others and make sure that you are sharing data analysis and perspectives with other people, and that makes it easier to be honest and ethical. And don't become emotionally or personally invested in the research or the findings or the program evaluation. Don't own it or make it a part of who you are, how you see yourself. It is simply an objective exercise in searching for the truth or searching for the answers about this program, and so it's not something that should be taken personally.